Okay, this is part 23, the Synagogue of Satan, Footprints in History. I promise that this is about the last in the video series, and also it's safe to say that the Synagogue of Satan is about out of tricks. I ended the last video with the end of the American Civil War, so I'll continue from there. After the American Civil War, international bankers increased their efforts to control the money of the United States. They would do this through manipulating the prices of gold and silver and seizing outright control of precious metals. They would also use legislation to control the money of the people of the United States and the people themselves. The international banking cabal wanted control of the vast wealth of the United States for its attempts at the domination of the entire world. There had been another backlash against known registered agents of the Rothschild like August Belmont and businesses connected to London banks. This led to the rise of Junius S. Morgan and his son John Pierpont Morgan. It was not known for many years that they also were connected to the Rothschilds and London banks. The Morgan interest came into being by financing both the Confederacy and the Union in the war. As many others, they had helped the Rothschilds and London banks to run through Union blockades of the Confederacy. There's also evidence that the Morgans were connected to the Vatican. The House of Morgan would be one of the most important financial instruments in the hands of the Synagogue of Satan. In 1868, the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution was ratified. It was basically a deceptive adhesion citizens contract. It fooled Americans into giving up their superior constitutional citizenship of their state. The very next year, an attempt was made to corner the gold market. President Grant was accused of collusion in the plot, but was exonerated by an investigation by James A. Garfield, who then was chairman of the House Banking Committee. Years later, as president, Garfield may actually have been assassinated for exposing the plot and exposing and condemning the perpetrators. In 1871, a private corporation was established with the same name as the United States. It was incorporated and only had jurisdiction in Washington, D.C. In 1873, the Mint or Coinage Act was passed, eliminating silver coinage and setting the United States on a gold standard. This became known as the Crime of 73 later and was opposed mostly in the western United States. The banking powers were unable to completely control silver, especially in the western United States and in trade transactions with China. A growing revolutionary movement spread across Russia. This was first led by Illuminati leader Giuseppe Mazzini, beginning as early as 1862. The movement would weaken the rule of Tsar Alexander II and ultimately lead to his assassination in 1881. With his death, the Rothschilds had vengeance. By this time, witchcraft fertility symbols like the Washington Monument and the Eiffel Tower were firmly in place. There's evidence from correspondence between Albert Pike and fellow Illuminatus Mazzini that several wars were planned to bring the world under total domination of the Illuminati, Freemasonry, and ultimately Satanists. In 1891, the secret Round Table group was formed by the Rothschilds, Cecil Rhodes, and others. It would later be known as the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States and the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. These organizations would branch into subsidiaries like the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderbergers. The British Empire and more invisible French Empire and their operatives used Japan and revolution to weaken the Russian Empire, which culminated with a major revolution in its domains in 1905. At the same time, a movement known as Pan-Turkism grew, intending the unification of Turkic people, but this movement was not actually even founded by the Turks themselves. It was begun by Hungarian Zionist Arminius Vambery. He was an advisor to the Ottoman Sultan, but actually operated for Viscount Palmerston and the British Foreign Office. Plans for the creation of a reconstituted nation of Israel in Ottoman-controlled Palestine emerged at this time. Vambery failed to persuade the Sultan on the idea. A pan-Islamic movement also came into being at about the same time. It also was not created by Muslims, but by the British Empire. Both Pan-Turkism and Pan-Islamism really had one goal: to destroy Russia. Scottish Rite Freemasonry, functioning through B'nai B'rith and working out of Salonika, was the primary tool used for the endeavor. It would control food and arms supplies, intelligence, and the press, among other things. In the United States also, several B'nai B'rith officials controlled the office of ambassador of the United States to Turkey for several years as part of the plan. By this time, large numbers of immigrants from Eastern Europe, many of them claiming to be Jews, came into the United States. It would be used to change the balance of political power in the United States. These political changes had the aim of forcing the United States to support the purposes of the international banking cabal. At this time, the United States still had no central bank since President Jackson had ended any charters of the Bank of the United States. The usual financial cycle followed the payments for agricultural produce. Interest manipulation by powerful banks and bankers was used to draw money back to the large banks of New York out of the hands of farming interests, but foreign banks and investors also profited off interest rate fluctuations. Bank and stock market manipulation ultimately led to the Panic of 1907, so-called, in New York. It ultimately induced greater demands for a central bank, which led to the Federal Reserve System. In 1908, a movement stemming from B'nai B'rith and the Illuminati, known as the Young Turks, overthrew the Ottoman Sultan in a military coup. The Young Turks were mostly Jews, and many of them had falsely converted to Islam, and they became known as the Donme. The Young Turks continued the operation of pan-Islamism and pan-Turkism. They destroyed the Ottoman Empire within just a few years and divided it up into unstable nations with ethnic groups spread across several states. The sinking of the ocean liner Titanic on April 15, 1912 is believed to have been part of a massive plot to create the Federal Reserve banking system in the United States. It's claimed that the Titanic was sunk on purpose to cover the elimination of three banking magnates who were standing in the way of the formation of the Federal Reserve Bank. The Titanic sank curiously on the same date as the beginning of the American Civil War, as well as the death of Abraham Lincoln. It's debated just how the ocean liner was sunk, whether as part of a massive insurance fraud and whether death on such a large scale was not intended. The tragedy also happened interestingly in an area veiled in naval and military secrecy, known to be a shipping lane for the Standard Oil Company. Many navies were already switching from coal to oil as fuel by this time. It seems that no sooner had the Titanic hit the bottom of the North Atlantic than two acts were passed in the United States in 1913 to allow for further crimes of the banking cabal. These were the ratification of the 16th Amendment and the Federal Reserve Act. The 16th Amendment allowed for a federal income tax free from the states. It paved the way of the Internal Revenue Service later and a way for the Federal Reserve to collect debts on its private money in the name of so-called income. Perpetrators enjoy putting coded messages declaring their crimes. Is this why the date of April 15th was chosen for tax time? Many believe that the Federal Reserve Act was never really passed because most of Congress was out for the Christmas holiday. The Federal Reserve is a privately owned bank and is not part of the United States government. It was controlled by American banks that were really subsidiaries of banks based in London. In fact, the bank acts to further empower international bankers and to finance war speculation. The bank would help finance World War I, which would be used to retrieve Palestine from the Turks, and at the same time weaken Germany and Russia, which could possibly gain from the end of Ottoman power. Ethnic and national strife stirred up in Russian and Ottoman dominions increased, especially with the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 13, eventually setting off World War I a year later. The British made many empty promises to ethnic minorities like the Kurds and Armenians. In 1915, the Young Turks used Kurds to kill an estimated 1 million Armenians. The Armenians were under the impression that they had the support of the British Empire, and so were the Kurds. The British Empire also stirred up Arab nationalism to turn the Arabs against Ottoman rule, but no promises to the Arabs were ever intended to be kept. The British and French would also use the Armenian genocide as an excuse to put an end to the Ottoman Empire and divide up most of it between themselves. The international cabal orchestrated an alliance between Britain, France, and Russia, but secretly the cabal supported the German Kaiser in destroying the power of the Tsars. That Germany ran out of the financial means to continue war with Russia, the cabal supposedly sent food and supplies as aid to Belgium, but these supplies were mostly sent to Germany in secret to help it continue its war against Russia. Instrumental in the secret support of Germany was future President of the United States Herbert Hoover. British General Kitchener was in favor of peace talks, but he conveniently died in a shipwreck on his way to Russia in 1916. Perhaps this is some kind of cosmic retribution on Kitchener for his treatment of the Boers in South Africa years before. Britain and France undoubtedly made secret promises to the Russian Tsar Nicholas II, but such promises were never intended to be fulfilled because plans were already laid that there would be no Tsar, no more obligation. The British Empire would use Jews in both Russia and the United States to undermine the Russian Empire. The communist Bolsheviks were mostly of claimed Jewish origin and were supported by the British Empire, elements in the United States, and others. Palestine was seized by the British Empire from Turkey in 1917, exactly 500 years from when the Ottoman Turks had taken it themselves. The British government, through Foreign Secretary Balfour, allowed Jews to move to Palestine for the first time. This was formalized by the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Curiously, Balfour had earlier supported laws banning Jewish immigration to Britain. Many in the Russian nobility were under the shadowy influence of Rasputin, who was undoubtedly a type of Carpocratian. Rasputin certainly warped the judgment of many in the Russian aristocracy, including the Tsar. The murders of the Tsar and his family were assured when Russians guarding the Tsar were changed to Bolshevik Jews. Tsar Nicholas and his family were sent to their final imprisonment at Yekaterinburg, curiously on April 30th, 1918, a date important for witchcraft. Even though Russia had surrendered and the Tsar had abdicated, the Rothschilds would again have vengeance with the murder of the Tsar and his family in 1918. The Catholic Church also had vengeance on Russia for preserving Orthodox Christianity. Massive amounts of wealth would then be stolen from the Tsar and the old nobility of Russia. In the United States, banks, mostly in New York, contracted credit by raising interest rates. This was to retrieve large amounts of money that were in circulation from spending on the recent war. The contraction caused the agricultural depression of the 1920s in the United States. At the same time, it set off a manufacturing and financial boom of the eastern United States known as the Roaring Twenties. Interest rates were then lowered by the Federal Reserve, allowing foreign investors to profit from rate differences and move wealth out of the United States, primarily its gold. Gold from the United States would also help Germany recover from hyperinflation in the wake of criminal reparations terms set by the British Empire and also the invisible French Empire and its banking cabal. Gold from the United States would ultimately finance World War II. At the same time, the beleaguered Russian aristocracy fought to regain control of Russia from the Bolsheviks, but the Bolsheviks were supported by wealth coming out of the United States. International banks helped Herbert Hoover become president of the United States. In return, Hoover would eliminate some of Germany's debts to help them rearm for another war. Germany would be used to keep the Bolsheviks under control and to justify the creation of a reconstituted nation of Israel and Palestine. On February 11, 1929, Vatican City in Rome was made an independent nation by the Lateran Treaty between the Kingdom of Italy and the Holy See. Vatican City would then be used to launder stolen Russian wealth, stockpiling it and keeping it out of the hands of its rightful owners. The banking powers had planned to cause the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange by this time to raise funds to defend against possible lawsuits brought by the Russian aristocracy attempting to retrieve their lost treasures, but the crash was delayed until October of 1929. In 1933, following a second collapse of the New York Stock Exchange, the 20-year charter of the Federal Reserve came to an end. It has never been renewed, so technically the Federal Reserve doesn't have any legal support, although it's not illegal. President Franklin Roosevelt took measures to continue the activities of the Federal Reserve and tangle it with the United States government. This would allow the Federal Reserve to continue even without a formal charter. So I'll continue in the next and last part with more of the crimes of the Synagogue of Satan up to the present. So until next time.